Welcome to the Sweet and Condensed Podcast, a podcast by people who love movies, people, and the magic that lives where they meet. All right, welcome back to another episode here with us at Sweet and Condensed. I'm Josh, and I am here interviewing, once again, Patrick Da Silva, PhD. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
And so for this episode, so if you listen to one of our previous episodes of the Medium Project, Patrick and I discussed the adaptations of Dune. We did a deep dive into the books, the world, where its inspirations were, and what it looked like on the screen. And Patrick and I mentioned how this project, or his invitation to do the Dune and Medium Project, was because of a course he did. And he allows a lot of unique ways of learning where it was self-led in a ways, which we'll get to here later in the interview. But it involves so many movies and so much of my things that I love, like watching Arrival, reading the short story for Arrival. Denis Villeneuve is one of my favorites who did Dune, but getting to dive into Arrival again. I reread Jurassic Park. I watched all the movies, which was great because we just did that. We just did that for the scorecard for our newsletter, shameless plug, sweetandcondensed.com. And because we watched Jurassic Park Rebirth. So it sent me down this whole path of watching all the Jurassic Parks, and it all stemmed from this class of looking at books, looking at movies, looking at texts. And I thought it would be so much fun to get you on the podcast and then just talk about, a little bit more about the class, race, religion, and science fiction, how it came to be, your own teaching, your own style. So I just think it's super cool. I'm becoming a big believer, maybe I've been drinking the Kool-Aid, but higher education. I've been a fan of, I've decided this last year, I'm fully diving in right now. I think it's just been really cool to see new ways of academia. And so, I wanted to bring Patrick back on. And so let's just dive straight into it. What about a basic introduction to this course of race, religion, and science fiction?
So I'll start with saying that a few years ago, I started teaching a course that was meant for kind of upper level undergrads called Religion and Science Fiction. And over time, what I heard from a number of the graduate students is they were like, how come we can't take this course? And I said, oh, that's a good question. So the department chair was very supportive, and she said, well, why don't we do this as a special topics course? I was really clear. I really wanted the word race to be in the title because I felt like in my own teaching, even about religion and science fiction, which for me, they intersect so powerfully in that both, when we think about the types of questions that religion or even philosophy has traditionally been focused on, and what I see in a lot of science fiction and fantasy are these different ways of defining who is human. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be dead? If you're dead, can you come back from the dead? When you come back, is that good or is it bad? Is it good in the sense of sort of a Christian theology of resurrection? Is it bad in terms of a vampire or a zombie thing? We see all this being played with. And another part of the story with religious studies is my academic training, and then science fiction is this idea of what do you do when you encounter people who are different? When you encounter the other, do you make friends with them? Do you drive them off? Do you invite them in and then eat them? We see all of these things kind of metaphorically and literally being depicted in these different discourses. And this very quickly led me into thinking about how the construction of race, and then related to that, gender and sexuality and, ability, disability, all is interwoven in my mind. And so the original course had units on sort of race and racism in Lord of the Rings, and then looking at Star Wars, Star Trek, Indigenous Futurism, and Afrofuturism. So Indigenous Futurism is looking at speculative fiction that centers the experience of Indigenous people. We usually use it to refer to Indigenous people here in the Americas, because then Afrofuturism is talking about primarily speculative fiction. So thinking about Octavia Butler and Kate Jemisin as prime examples, that centers the experience of Black people Now there's a related subgenre called Africanfuturism, all one word, which is focused on the experiences of Black people on the African continent, because the criticism was that Afrofuturism was really talking about Black people in the diaspora. And then I had units on like Jediism, which is a new religious movement where these people are like, hey, we're inspired by the Force, we're inspired by the Star Wars world, we're going to treat it like it's real or real enough. And we would dig into the difference between like history-based religious movements and then fiction-based religious movements. And I would make the claim that unless you have a theological like faith commitment to seeing your religious tradition as capital T true, then aren't they all fiction-based from a certain point of view? to quote perhaps my favorite line from Star Wars. So then for this course that you and I took, I added in material. I had, I wanted to add stuff on cyberpunk. So we read like Neuromancer by Gibson, stuff on monsters. So like I read Frankenstein for the first time by Mary Shelley, which a lot of people look at as the sort of quote unquote original science fiction novel from 1818. Of course, original in the Western tradition, because speculative fiction arguably has been going on since humans could think.
Okay.
And then the other big thing I did is I set up the course from the beginning where you as students had a lot of autonomy. So we met on the first day and we looked at the syllabus together, and you all made suggestions about things that we could add. And of course, it is a little bit of a zero-sum game. So if we added things, then we had to reject other things that I had come up with. And that was fine, because who is the course for? The course is for the students. The course is not actually for me as the instructor. At least that's how I approach it. And you all had great, of course, ideas, and we're all smarter together than we are alone. And yeah, we kind of went from there. We also, another part of the student autonomy piece was you all decided how you would be evaluated. So I came in and said, well, maybe we'll do this many response papers and this kind of final project. And then you all said, how about we do more of this and less of that and whatever. And I was flexible on the formatting. So a response paper could be, kind of formal paper, or it could be a podcast. And I was fine with that. And also for the final paper, I allowed students to do what are called unEssays, which is where it's a more creative project. So I've been doing unEssays in my other course on religion and science fiction, and I just wrote up a little list of what that could look like. So let me provide that list, and then I want to give you a little bit of background on how I got to that point.
Okay.
In sort of my pedagogy. So the unEssays, just here are some highlights from over the years. If any of you have read Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, the main character, Lauren, the book is written in the form of these journal entries. So I had a student who read and reread that novel so many times, he created an illustrated version of the journal, which was super detailed. It was an incredible piece of art that he spent hours and hours on. I've had students come up with role-playing games kind of based on the choose your own adventure model. So like they'd make a PowerPoint or some type of slide deck that then it was like, you got to choose what type of journey you were on as a character.
Oh, that's cool.
I had a student come up with a cookbook. That was really fun. There was a student who was really into audio production, and she came up with these audio tracks that were meant to evoke the experiences depicted in short stories that she had been reading that had kind of a gothic horror vibe. That was by far the creepiest unessay that I've got. But she really had fun with it,
Yeah.
I've gotten a series of paintings inspired by books like Chronicles of Narnia. And then there was another kind of illustrated journal inspired by Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where a student was like, what might the Dr. Frankenstein, what might he have drawn in some hypothetical like journal, right?
Yeah.
And so again, the student was trying to make it look like it was from the early 19th century. It was an incredible, incredible project. And so the upshot of the unessay is that students spend just as much or more time on these unessays as they do on conventional academic essays.
Right.
The work is personal, it's intrinsically motivated, they are choosing what to do, and then I support them by talking through their projects throughout the course, and we take time in class and where people who are doing creative projects like meet together to like share what's going well and what's going not so well and support one another. And then the students who are doing their traditional formal analytical papers, they meet together and support one another. And of course, I'm there to support everybody. So I guess a big question then would be, how did I get to this point, right? Because even when I was in college, it was pretty traditional pedagogy. You walked into the room, you were the student, you sat down, the professor walked in, they stood at the front of the room, and they lectured, and you took notes, right? And rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat.
Yep.
And maybe that room had 20 students and maybe it had 200, but that was what you did. And over time, I think in my journey as an educator and especially eventually as a parent, I started to see how even though I myself was thriving in that context, like I did very well in school. School was pretty easy for me. I just showed up. I was good at being quiet and doing what I was told. And that's what school is, as the conventional school, at least in the US, that's what I know best. And even my experiences living overseas, that's what teachers wanted, you know, and especially as a young boy, it was like, oh, you get a young boy who will just sit quietly in the corner, 50 stars.
Right.
For him.
50 stars.
Then, yeah, what I started to notice is that, especially by the time I started teaching kind of in my late 20s, then fewer and fewer of my students, regardless of what type of institution I was teaching at the community college or at a private university, is fewer and fewer of them were thriving with that type of approach. And it had nothing to do with like a lack of intelligence at all. It had nothing to do with that. It had to do with they were like, this doesn't work for me in my body and in my mind, because guess where your mind is located? It's inside of your body. So I had students asking me, hey, do you mind if I just like get up and like move around a bit in the back of the room if we're in the middle of a long class? And at first I was like, oh, that's so disruptive. And then I was like, that's fine, you know? And again, these are college students. So legally speaking, they're adults.
Right.
And I wanted to treat them as adults. Then, you know, when I became a parent, you know, by the time my son turned, 2, 3, we started to see that he was wired differently than a lot of the other kids, even his age. And so eventually he's diagnosed as having these various special needs. And it was very clear that what was expected of him as he got into school, like even like kindergarten and first grade, that was just kind of a real challenge for him. And it felt like, again, it was not some question about his overall intelligence in any way, but it was like neurologically, he was wired in such a way that what he was being expected to do, and not asked to do, but demanded, right, required to do, was not working for him. And, you know, it's one thing when someone is 20 years old and is like, oh, you want me to write this paper, but I don't want to. Well, I'm like, well, here's the first day of the course. Here's the syllabus. This is part of the skills that we're building in this course. If this isn't for you, I respect that, but you can take a different course. But when a person is 6 years old, then they, you know, it feels like society doesn't treat children as full-fledged humans. We sort of act like, no, you're a child. You don't get any say.
Right.
You don't get autonomy.
Right.
Autonomy is what you get when you're older and, frankly, when you're wealthier.
Right.
Because in our society, money equates with getting to do whatever you want, which is what we see at the, the people who have the most money get to do whatever they want.
Right.
Pretty much.
Like build submarines and take them, get blown up.
Yeah.
There's a Netflix documentary now, but anyways, back to you.
That's right. And so as I going through this journey of teaching, and especially going through the pandemic, I was just like, okay, I need to rework how I'm doing this. I'm going to be way more flexible. So if there's a deadline, like an assignment is due, I was like, well, as long as it's turned in before the final grade is due to the registrar, which is like a deadline imposed on me from above, then I have control and I can show my students, grace and compassion. And I think that's what we need more of in the world. And so I had started to do that, earlier on, but really became like very sharply clear to me that was required during the pandemic. And I'd have students who, again, they're, these students where I was teaching at the time at community college, who were in this position where they were being asked to be the ones at 18, 19 years old to enforce the strictest of the lockdown protocols. If you're working front of house at a restaurant, if you're working at Target or Walmart, or you're working at a hair salon, people come in and you're the one who's put in the position to tell them they have to put on a mask or leave. And, people in America and all over the world had a lot of feelings about being required to put on a small piece of fabric.
Right.
How dare the government impose? How dare they? And I was just noticing how, like, gosh, my students are not being protected from having to deal with kind of the worst side of humanity that was coming out. Instead, because of their socioeconomic status, they were working in jobs where they were facing the brunt of that. And I thought, this really is unfair. And they appreciated it when I did something that to me was very, very small and very easy to do, like, oh yeah, you didn't get your response paper in or your test done on time. Like, well, can you get it to me in the next week? Like, and they would say, oh my God. I mean, sometimes they would say, can I just have 6 more hours? And I was like, why don't you take 60 more hours? It's just like, it's such a small thing. And yet that compassion that we can show for one another as human beings and treat one another as human beings is just so profoundly absent in large parts of our educational system. Right. And, we can go forward from there, but the educational system is what I know best. So when it came to this class, I wanted to try and really explicitly incorporate a lot of what I had learned in these different parts of my life, both professionally and personally.
Okay.
And so that's why when we showed up, I just wanted to make it like, you want to watch, like, with Dune, you want to read the novel? Great. You want to watch the films? Great. That's fine for me. Also, I would put a ton of stuff on the syllabus. Like there might be 10, 12 things, like 2 movies and 5 podcasts and 4 academic articles and whatever. And I just told you all, read, watch, and listen to whatever resonates with you and what works for your life. 1 week, you might have a ton of bandwidth to tackle an academic course. Another week, you're like, all I can do is like show up for class.
Yeah.
Because of what's going on in your life as a human being, the vast majority of your life has nothing to do with taking my class. Right. And frankly, the vast majority of your life is more important than taking my class. Not because my class is it's important to me. Right. But just like recognizing that all of you as students are, 360-degree, 3-dimensional human beings. You're not human workings or human readings or human, producers or consumers. Right. You're human beings. You exist. And we can change education, I really believe, so that we honor that. And you know what? People will retain more of the content that we are so kind of hung up on. Because like for me, a long time ago, with a lot of my classes, I was like, I don't care if people come out of a class on the Quran and can name all of God's 99 names or, from the Quran or you know what I mean? Like that's not important. What's important to me is that you've learned to ask more and more different types of questions because that is a skill that will serve you every day for the rest of your life.
I love that. That's so good. I think I have so many thoughts. You said so much and it's so great. And it's a beautiful thing to see people in any space, and in this context, academia, having a holistic approach to people, to recognize that it's my whole life. It's not just this class. Like, your class is very important. I think your class is important. What I'm doing is important. But if I don't take this little sliver of that 2 hours of your class, if I don't take the other outside of the bigger chunk of my life seriously, then I won't be healthy enough to even show up in that little space. And I think recognizing, like, oh yeah, I am important. My health is important. Physically, it's important. My mental health, my physical health, those things are all very, very important. And if I can focus on those things, then I'll be able to show up more wholly and in a better way and actually learn in that 2-hour window where I get to spend time with you and other people. And I think I noticed I really love how, because you don't see this a lot in academia, but it comes from time to time, but you said the class we took when you were the instructor, you're the professor. And I love that because you genuinely are like, oh yeah, I'm learning alongside of you. Like, you even saying that you read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein for the first time, but yet it's on the syllabus, and it's different when you're experiencing something alongside with the professor, and even that language of saying, yeah, we took this course together, rather than me saying I took this course from, because it does communicate this, we're colleagues, this partnership, this autonomous learning that you're talking about. Because I was also one of those students that showed up, from elementary school till about mid-high school, where it was like, I do the right thing. I'm going to turn in my homework. I'm going to do all this stuff. I'm going to regurgitate. And I didn't really know what I liked, because I was just memorizing to use the analogy of 90 names of God. I was only memorizing what they wanted me to memorize in that subject, or doing the things. I didn't know about my passion for movies until I've always loved watching movies, but I didn't discover my passion for investigating, if you will, or asking good questions about movies until 2014, when January 2014 is when I started writing my first screenplay and getting into film on a more professional level. And I graduated from undergrad in May 2014. So it's like I was already psych major and communications, which has served me well, but there's these other passions. It's like, oh yeah, that doesn't come from regurgitating. It comes from discovering. I like what you said about they even learn more. And there's a quote, I think it's arbitrary. It's a statistic, like most statistics I feel like maybe are just made up, but no. But people remember 5% of what they're told and 95% of what they discover. And I just thought that was a very interesting way to frame what engaging with education, like you said. Like, if this is self-taught and self-led, they're going to retain this information because they are discovering it. They're excited. It's something they're moving along a wavelength of passion, rather than this is what you're told to do, which ironically can sometimes be the same path, but you're more resistant when someone's telling you to go down this path than you discovering to go down this path. You reminded me a lot of Bell Hooks. That's a big book, a reel to reel. I have it here. I really like this book. I found it, and it said, like, for anybody who thinks movies are worth arguing over, and I was like, I'm buying this, like, immediately. Expedited shipping. But movies make magic. They change things. That's the opening of this book, and I think it's so great. But they said in here that when they were teaching, they started realizing students reading the classics and the typical, they weren't engaged with it, and they got into film criticism because they started They started assigning movies, and Bell Hooks started realizing students were understanding that they did want to talk about race and classism and gender and sexuality when it came to movies, but they didn't want to read these traditional academic assignments. So this choose your own adventure is just so fascinating to me. It is very intimidating. I should also say that in this course, like, my first master's course was in 2022. I had an 8-year span between. In my first class, they're like, you're going to do this contract, and you get to decide what you're going to do, what grade you're going to try to attain. And I was like panicking. I'm like, what do you mean? You're the professor. You're the teacher. You tell me. You grade me. You tell me the deadlines. And this idea of, and again, it's power dynamics or autonomy of like, oh, I get to assign my own grade and then I get to fight for myself and then they get to say, I accept that. Or if I don't accept that, they're going to argue why and then I can rebuttal. And I'm like, that's such a new way of conversating when it comes to my learning and education. Because even when people are like, can I get more time? I still am like, I got to read everything on the syllabus and I have to turn everything on time. So your class, that was in 2022, that first master's class, and now we're in, was it 2025, a 10-week course, and putting so much on there, but realizing we can choose our own adventure. I still suffer from read everything, but this is leading into a question somewhere in here. But I just have to ask because of, Bell Hooks saying movies are magic, they change things. We at Sweet and Condensed really believe this idea of movies are magic. They help orient us. Like they help us find our way through life, our significance in finding a home within spaces, but also within ourselves. At least this is for me too. This is how I engage with movies. And to your point about the Jediism that's been born out of fiction, but now it's orienting people in real life. And I think that there's this relationship with movies and me and orientation and the way I find home in this world or in this reality we have constructed here on Earth. And so I just am curious about you. Why TV and movies for you, and why TV and movies for you specifically, like in an education context with these unEssays, with the self-guided learning and curriculum. I'm just so curious to why TVs and movies, because they're so important to us here at Sweet and Condensed.
Sure. Well, I think if you're approaching it from just from science fiction, right? Then there's, if you look at Star Trek and Star Wars alone, these are two of the most influential sci-fi franchises that started off in the visual form, right? They've each spawned, hundreds, dozens of books and comic books, and they hopefully will continue to do so. But they start off visual, right?
Okay.
And so if you're going to teach about those franchises, I assign episodes of The Mandalorian, or I assign episodes of Star Trek. So there's that very pragmatic kind of logistical argument. But there's also the fact that culturally we have been in the midst of, and this is going to continue, a transition away from reading to watching. And, I taught this course, Islam and Film, and I forget what exactly the article was about, but I was on the light rail in Denver was actually working during this time. So I was taking it, and, I was just reading the news and passing time on the way down to campus. And there was this article, I think it was on CNN, which I don't think of as being a very particularly challenging reading level. And it was on exactly what we were going to talk about in class that day. So I went on to our learning management system, Canvas, and I said I preset an announcement to drop when class started that would give them all the link to the story. And I got to class and I said, okay, first thing, I know you prepped XYZ. I want us to read this, 1,000-word, 800-word op-ed piece that I thought that was really relevant to what we're talking about that day. And what struck me is they struggled to read it. These are all undergrads at a institution that thinks of itself as very high level. And these undergraduate students, it was like they didn't know what to do. They were like, what do you mean read it? I said, read it? Read it. And it's like they just, as a group, they kind of froze. And for me, I read a lot.
Yeah.
On the light rail, it took me 2 to 3 minutes to read it. And, I was like, well, 10 minutes, 15 minutes went by in class. And I was like, okay, that was a good kind of light bulb moment for me. It was like, oh, they aren't trained to do this. It has nothing to do with raw intelligence. It's nothing to do with that. Not at all. Sure, there are people who have, dyslexia. So like, of course, right?
Right.
But that's not what was going on here, because all 20 of them were not dyslexic. Even though that's, I believe, the most common kind of learning difference out there.
Okay.
They just on a fundamental level didn't understand what they were supposed to do. Like they could read the words, but it was like, but if I showed them a clip from a movie, then they understood innately, or, like it was much more native to them to be like, oh, I'm watching this and then I can like talk about it. The time they needed to process what they were taking in was so much longer when they had to read it compared to watching it. And how that works with like a podcast or, something, like a song, that's somewhere in between, I think.
Okay.
And so, that's, I think, just anyone, this is kind of a perpetual thing with our species, right? We yearn for the good old days and, making XYZ great again, when maybe it was never that great to begin with for most of the people involved. And so here it's like, reading isn't going away as a skill, but with the rise of social media platforms that are basically purely or almost purely video or visual, like TikTok is a great example, then what we're seeing is generations that are coming up, and it's like, this is how they are used to interacting with the world. And you even see it in TV shows like The Expanse, which is of course an adaptation of a series of books, wonderful science fiction series. So much in The Expanse on race in particular that I highly recommend it. And a lot of scientists I know like it because they feel like the depiction of how gravity works and is actually like scientifically much more accurate than like in Star Wars and Star Trek, where there's all this hand waving, like, who needs a seatbelt on the Enterprise? Why would you need a seatbelt? Whereas on The Expanse, they're all like strapped in when they have any velocity. But it's like the characters a lot of times, yes, they exchange text messages, but they also will just send lots of short video clips to each other on their terminals, or which is their equivalent of our smartphone. Right. And except way more advanced. And I remember watching that in the TV adaptation of that series compared to reading it. I thought, that actually is much more in keeping with where we are at as a society today in terms of our depictions of the future. Whereas if you watch Star Trek and Next Generation, they're sending messages to each other, but when they have their fancy tricorder, they're not sending like video to one another usually, or almost never, right? They're sending like text messages, and they don't show it to you on the screen because we didn't even really have that technology when that show was on air. So there's lots of reasons to go with TV and film. There's so much, just like what you're saying with bell hooks, who was definitely inspiration for me in terms of my pedagogy. But what Hooks is saying there really rings true with me, that you if you want to reach people, you have to let go of your own ego. If you actually want to connect with people, and you have to kind of meet them on their terms. Right. It's just like with learning different languages. So if you go to a country where people don't speak the languages that you speak, and you insist on them speaking to you in languages that you speak, like let's say you speak English and you go to Mexico and you're like, everyone should speak to me in English, they will understandably be like, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense to us. You're in our house. And, there's, of course, when your people are guests or visitors in your home or in your community, and you want to show them that you're making an effort to be hospitable, you can speak to them in their language. There's that piece, of course. But this is where we kind of get this stereotype of the kind of the ugly American who just goes around the world shouting at people in ever louder volume levels of English, assuming that increased volume will magically convey meaning to other people who speak different, who don't speak English. Right. And it's quite amazing to travel as an American and then speak to people in their own language, and it's like they're so surprised because it's not part of our brand culturally. So, like when I lived in Egypt and Morocco and then talking to people in Arabic, even though I was very much just like a student of it, like very early on in my studies, but people really appreciated that. And I think that's a powerful thing. So in terms as a teacher, if I'm trying to convey these ideas to students, the students today are just much more comfortable with visual media than they are with written text. And then if you get into things like reading styles of texts like that are from different time periods, so like I mentioned, reading Frankenstein.
Yep.
Like even for me at the beginning of reading Frankenstein, I was like I tried to read it over the winter, I think. And I found a free copy online because obviously it's long out of copyright. And just kind of jumping into it, I thought, what's going on? This is hard. Why are there these letters from this guy who's in the Arctic Circle? Right.
Right.
But then I went to my library, which I go there a lot, like just my local library, and they had this edition that was the 1818 original text and had a beautiful introduction by like a scholar of Victorian, literature of Frankenstein specifically. And her introduction helped me understand, okay, this is the journey I'm about to go on. And it prepped me for it. And so then I jumped into it and then I just like loved it. I mean, these beautiful passages describing, they're in Switzerland and they're, they're going, and then they're in Scotland and it's like describing the natural world. That was very kind of like on brand for kind of the romanticism kind of piece of how people classify eras of literature. And then of course the story is just so compelling, and the way that the creature, everyone thinks that Frankenstein is the name of the monster, but actually Frankenstein is the name of the scientist who creates the monster. The monster is referred to various terms: the creature, the wretch, the devil, so forth. I actually have only seen clips of all these various film adaptations of Frankenstein, and so one of the things I want to do moving forward, maybe later this summer, is start to watch some of them, because I'm really curious. And there's a new one also that's being produced soon, so that will also be exciting.
It comes out later this year, I think, on Netflix.
Yeah.
It's Guillermo del Toro, one of my favorite filmmakers. But anyways, continue. Sorry.
Yeah. So I think, movies are incredible. I mean, this sensorial experience you get from going to the movies. And sometimes you can get it, like I mentioned in our episode on Dune, that even watching Dune Part 1 on my tiny TV here at home, I was like, oh my God, I'm in the desert. And then when I saw Part 2 in the theater, I was like, oh, I'm on that sandworm.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
And that's really, really beautiful. It's magical. You forget where you are. I took my son to see Jurassic World Rebirth. Yeah. And he went, it was like his friend invited him to go, and me and the other dad, we took the boys, and like we were just like driving to the movie theater with them, the boys in the back of the car, just like talking about, well, what kind of dinosaurs are they going to see? And they were totally immersed in it. And then my son has the Mosasaurus from the movie. Okay. And so in the beginning of the movie, this isn't much of a spoiler because it's kind of in a trailer, there's this family and the Mosasaurus is like knocking the boat around. And I'm like, are we going to see these people get killed here? That seems kind of dark. And, I think my son's friend asked him, like, are they going to get killed? And number one, my son said, well, they're main characters, so they can't die. Which I was like, what kind of media literacy is that? Like, I don't think I understood that about narrative until I was maybe in my mid 20s. Like, I didn't understand that.
That's funny.
And then also he had his toy, the Mosasaurus, that he named Drippy. And so like Mosasaurus on the screen is causing havoc, right? And I'm like, oh my God, it's so, and he's just like, look, it's Drippy.
Yeah.
And it just made me think a lot about, and of course you can be cynical and be like, okay, so they, especially since Star Wars, like companies were like, oh my God, we can make tons of money off people by selling merch. And but that also then, thinking less cynically, is a way of extending the immersive experience.
Right.
So, how many hours did I spend playing with my Star Wars, toys, right? Or
Right.
I had
Right.
Legos that I made little TIE fighters out of.
Right.
And so for my son, it's like with How to Train Your Dragon, with the Jurassic World Rebirth, and other things. With Mufasa, we saw that in the theater. That was
Yeah.
pretty epic. It's like it's not just that you're immersed in that world in the theater or when you're watching at home, but the fact that you have this multimedia experience where there's a coloring book, there's novels that are, written either for adults or for young people, for children. All of that builds this world into which you can just kind of slide. And I mean, for me in elementary school, here I'm talking about when I lived in Sudan, I would come home and I would just put in Star Wars, the first one. And it's like, I looked outside and it was desert. I looked on the TV screen, it was desert, like when they're on Tatooine.
Right.
And it's like, that was part of what made it so influential for me, which I didn't even kind of appreciate until I was writing this kind of autobiographical essay about why I, study religion and science fiction.
Okay.
But it's like when you see this connection between this world depicted visually on screen and your own world, then that is just really, really, really powerful in ways that, especially as a younger person, you might not. I certainly didn't appreciate.
Right.
And that also speaks to why there's this incredible power of expanding representation on screen. So if you see someone, like even in Skeleton Crew, one of the more recent Disney era Star Wars TV shows, there's a character who has this disability. It's like she was in some type of accident. She has these like cybernetic parts in it, and it both enhances her abilities, but it also limits her abilities because, she, in certain environments, like the parts corrode and it's like she could die. And if you're unaugmented, you're unmodified, then you don't have that same type of challenge. And she's like, she has, her friend is like, come with me. And this girl is like, well, you don't understand. I can't do it the same way that you do. I'm different. And, to accept me as a full-fledged person, you have to accept that I am different. That doesn't necessarily mean lesser than.
Right.
It only means lesser than if you take it that way. Right. So I think that's something that's also very powerful in seeing what it's like for people who are in communities that aren't typically depicted on screen, especially historically. So the power of going back now to when I was growing up, like with Star Trek Deep Space Nine, to have Avery Brooks playing Benjamin Sisko, and having a black man be the lead, eventually the commander, and then eventually he's promoted and becomes captain of that space station. And having Catherine Janeway, right, be the captain on Voyager, and so forth, right? Even if we can roll it forward into New Trek and with the Michael Burnham character on Star Trek Discovery, having a black woman be the lead, and how people have strong opinions about that.
Yep.
Right?
Right.
And that's very, very powerful to pay attention to. A big light bulb moment for me with how all this intertwines was when the Ghostbusters came out, where it was all women.
Oh, yeah, yep.
And there was, a black woman as a Ghostbuster, and people lost their minds. And I just thought, this is Ghostbusters. Like, to me, this is one of the most over-the-top, cheesy, ridiculous IPs that is out there. And it's really fun to watch, and I enjoyed watching the original ones and the cartoon, and yeah. But the fact that this woman got all this hate just because she was a black woman on screen playing the part of a Ghostbuster, I thought, well, I don't know, our species isn't doing so well.
Right. And I mean, that from one of the big ones for me remembering was the Rings of Power. People are like, there's no black elves, and we're talking.
I know. I'm like, people, there are elves. So
yeah,
we need to, we're not really tied to something, some supposed construction of historical accuracy.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, there are black elves. There's Black
Yeah.
Balkans too.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
No, and I think the you bringing up to the participation. That's the word I keep thinking about is when your son brings the, I'm going to say it wrong,
Mosasaurus.
Mosasaurus. When your son brings the Mosasaurus, he names it Drippy. He's participating with this world now, like this immersion, and then all of a sudden you then are participating in art as we're watching it. Your mind's going places, you're doing all this stuff, but then you're participating in real life. I'm going to go get this dinosaur and I'm going to name it, and now it becomes a friend, it becomes a character, I play with it. And on the representation side of it is I think you watch something and you see what's possible. You know, it's like this is why representation of race, gender, sexuality, it can, people, I often hear people say movies can be escapism, but often they have social locations or positions of more privilege and power. And I'm like, yeah, it's escapism because your life is, the world's made for you. It's escapism in a healthy way when worlds aren't, our reality is not made for us. So then we go into these movies and we participate in this thing called cinema. And then we're like, wait, I can construct a different world where I can be president, I can be a leader, I can be a doctor, I can be all these other forms of whatever it is the world says that we should be aspiring to be. Or I can be filmmakers. How many people watched films and were like, oh, I can do that once I learned, you know, these other people with similar social locations and different identities such as me. Oh, I can do that now. Which brings me to the question before we wrap up here, just briefly, the creative projects. How did the students participate in the cinema, the TV shows, and the novels and short stories that you had a part of the syllabus, the podcasts? How did they participate in them when it comes to your unEssays final projects in a creative way?
Well, there were some students who did podcasts or just did audio recordings. So yeah, a podcast for their response papers. And there were some people who, with the unEssays for the final project, I had a whole bunch who did things. So let me just pull up this list here so I remember people. And we're going to do these interviews with the students. That's going to be a down the road project. But so I had one student do like a zine on Wakanda and blackness, like in the Black Panther series. I had a bunch of students write creative, like just like their own fiction. So one student who researches mushrooms and their use in sort of sacred rituals and is researching questions of like cultural appropriation. She wrote a story about sort of mushrooms that I really, really enjoyed. Other people wrote, dystopia is very popular. So, and a number of people tackled dystopia in different ways. One student in particular was inspired by Octavia Butler's parable of the sower, and she created like a journal, sort of like a vision journal with these prompts to think through what type of world you might be able to create. Because part of the parable of the sower story is that the Lauren character is sort of creating this new religious movement called Earthseed. And, the opening line of Earthseed is that, or slogan, if you will, is God is change. And that there's this interplay between God and us. And we have a much more active role to play, kind of a relationship with this thing that we're going to call God in changing the world around us. And then how does that set us up to be resilient in the face of incredible challenges? The creative projects were a lot of fun. I think also for students who are just used to, I walk in, I do another analytical paper. When you're given a choice to be like, oh, I can do something different, then that is very motivating for some students. Other students say, hey, you know what? I want to write another paper, and I am here for that. I love a properly formatted Chicago-style footnote. It is one of my favorite things to read. And I always tell students, if you think this is hard, wait until you're doing your taxes. This is much easier than doing your taxes. Now maybe you want to pay someone to do your taxes, but if you don't and they have to do them, then you might remember like, oh, I have to fill out this form this exact way. And if I don't, then I pay the government more money than I really am supposed to. So it has a pocketbook impact.
Right.
So I think the unessays are a really fun way of also just like as a teacher, you get to know your students a little bit better because they show up in different ways. They show, one of the most beautiful things about education is when you feel like you're coming into your own, you're being a fuller version of yourself. And sometimes the classroom can provide that for people. It can also do the opposite, right? It can be oppressive, suppressive, denigrating, insulting. Education has been used to strip away people's humanity in so many cases. But for me as an educator, I'm really looking at it. What can I do in my classes that gives people a chance to play with what it means for them to be human? It can be a safe space for them to experiment, for them to take risks, and for me to be a supportive kind of partner in that process. And I'm taking risks too, Sometimes I put together a lesson plan, and I tell you, in my head, I'm walking in, I'm like, this is going to go great. And 5 minutes in, I'm like, this has blown up in my face because I got it so wrong. Yeah. And sometimes you have to just be willing to roll with it. I mean, you always have to roll with it. What you plan may not actually come out the way that you intended it. And for me, there's always a bigger kind of spark, if you will, when I'm improvising. Yeah. So when things go exactly to plan, I'm like, well, okay, everything went to plan, but that wasn't very exciting, was it? It's kind of, but whereas if we're improvising together, I'm more of a John Coltrane person.
There you go.
Then, it might look like noise to the outside, but on the inside, if you're all in it together, then it's really beautiful and it's transformative. And people just, they spontaneously share ideas and thoughts. And, I'll share one example from one of my classes from a few years ago in religion and science fiction. We were talking about this whole thing of Jediism, right? And this student who was pretty quiet, she presented like she was an athlete. She was, she took this class because she had Division I athlete. So half of her life is like signed away in blood, right? To all the practices and the games and the travel. Yeah. I mean, they don't get much choice, right? Right. When you're an athlete at that level in college, they don't get to have a college experience like I had, where I was like up until 4 a.m. every night, and then awake and wake up at 2 p.m. and like they're living very like structured lives. And I'd always offer this course in the morning, so I got a lot of people who were in very restricted scheduling kind of situations. Okay. She made this observation about how religion with like Star Wars or Star Trek fandom, which is distinct from the religious movement, Jediism, but how the fandom is not working. People aren't double dipping. She used that phrase, double dipping, because we have this idea with the religious identity that it's like, well, if I'm Christian, I can't also be Jewish. Or if I'm like Hindu, I can't also be Muslim, right? And there's lots of historical examples that poke holes in that, number one. But we still have that as a set of received like sort of categories about how religion works. That you're part of a team, and you're not part of, if you're part of team A, you're not part of team B. Right. Right? So, like if you're a fan of like the Philadelphia, the Eagles. The Eagles. You're not going to be a Giants fan. Right. Like you're not going to do that. And so people map that type of typology, or that approach onto like religious categories. So what my student was pointing out really, really beautifully was that when people go to conventions, Comic-Con and so forth, and they really geek out, and you're cosplaying, and you're going to panels where people are talking about the latest book or movie or comic book in whatever fandom you're into, it starts to look very kind of religious, but that a lot of those people are not thinking of their Star Wars or Star Trek or whatever, or Buffy or whatever fandom as being equivalent to or superseding their religious identity if they have one. Of course, that's a whole other sociological thing to talk about, is how big chunk of our population in the U.S. now identify as religious nones, mean Nones, where they don't have any affiliation with any type of religious group. So contrast this with someone who says, I'm so into the Jedi, that I am going to write down Jediism as my official religion on a census, as a lot of people did a few years ago in these censuses that were conducted in like the UK and in Australia and New Zealand, right? And it's like, and it wasn't just a joke. I mean, so for some people it's a joke, but for some people it's like, no, this is a real thing for me. And this is like, these are groups that they meet and they believe that what George Lucas established and conveyed through the films, even if they don't believe that they are like force sensitive, they think that there's something there that is so powerful and so meaningful that they can use it to structure their lives. And, and that's what religion is in many cases.
Right. Yeah. No, yeah. A lot of my definitions that I use with religion is that religion as orientation. Charles H. Long says that it's like, it's the human journey. It's how do we find our significance? And Sarah Ahmed's work on orientation, there's a lot of that. How do we make our way through life? And how do we find home? How do we find home in our bodies? And how do we find home in communities? What are the objects, the texts, the communities, the people? What are the things that we're drawn to and oriented to? And so I always joke, because I used to be, I was a part of a faith community, and then it got into it's a relationship, not religion. I'm spiritual, not religious. And now I'm like, wait, with my work I've been doing, I'm like, I think everyone's religious when I look at it as religion as orientation, not religious in the traditional Western academic sense of it. But anyways.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm really looking forward to hearing more of the interviews, because I was in the class, but I didn't get to, obviously I know my final project, which was one of the I love dystopians. So I lean towards that, and about identity, and there's some religion aspects to it. And anyways, that was my final project, but I didn't get to really, other than talking brief conversation with other students. So I'm looking forward to these interviews. Patrick's going to interview upwards of 6, maybe even more people about their subjects and their creative projects more in depth. And they'll be sharing that on Worlds Beyond Worlds, his new Substack, which we'll all have linked in the podcast. It's going to be released TBD, but keep an eye on that. Go over there, subscribe. All the plugins, all the plugs today is going to be for Patrick. So share this episode with people who sound interesting. Subscribe to Worlds Beyond Worlds. There'll be a link. Give him money. He has paid stuff on there. Invest, support this project. I think it's really cool. I am going to continue to be helping with some of the production, but it's going to be on that podcast channel. So if this episode sounded interesting to you and you want to keep following up on this, make sure you stay in touch with Worlds Beyond Worlds, because that's where the hosting of the episodes will be. And I'm just really excited and looking forward to it, Patrick.
Well, thank you. I appreciate all of your support. And, we had a great class together, and it was really something that everyone contributed to and kind of co-created. And my colleagues would ask me, how's that class going? It's pretty easy. They're like, it's easy? And I was like, well, the subject material is hard, but I just show up and I walk in and I say, well, what do you all think? And then, we go by 2 hours in a flash. Because everyone, I think it helped the way that I set it up. Everyone came in having prepared something really deeply. And so then they showed up, and you could talk about this movie and someone else would talk about that book, and we would co-create, what was going on, and it was this really collaborative atmosphere that I think worked for most people. So
yeah. People would ask me about that class, and I'd say, it's 2 hours of just all of us nerding out about what we're nerdy about, and I loved it. I remember someone needed to be walked somewhere, and they're like, hey, does someone want to walk with them? And then someone goes, you have my sword. And someone else was like, and my axe. It was just like, oh my gosh, we are just a bunch of sci-fi, Lord of the Rings, fantasy, just fanatics and nerds getting to hang out for 2 hours and learn. So, but yeah, thanks again. Thanks for being on the podcast. I hope this isn't the last episode we do. I can talk to you forever. So appreciate it. Till next time, everyone.
All right. Thank you.